The dust had not yet settled when Isaiah Crawford turned to face her. He stood in the center of Caldwell Street with 3 men lying in the dirt behind him and one still groaning near the horse trough, and he turned with the unhurried ease of a man who had done this before, who carried the weight of it the same way he carried his gun belt, always necessarily, without complaint. His dark eyes swept the crowd that had frozen along the boardwalks and storefronts of Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico territory, in that suspended moment of 1883 that comes after catastrophic noise and precedes the return of ordinary sound. He swept the crowd and found her immediately. Augusta Dugan stood at the edge of the gathering, her back pressed against the sun-bleached post of the mercantile, her knuckles white around the handle of the carpetbag she carried. She had not run. Every other woman on the street had retreated into doorways or pressed against their husbands, but she had stood perfectly still, and Isaiah Crawford, who noticed everything, had noticed that. She was watching him with eyes the color of amber whiskey held up to a late afternoon window, and there was something in those eyes that was not fear and was not admiration, and was not the morbid fascination that the others wore. It was something harder. Something that looked from a distance remarkably like recognition. He had walked toward her. The crowd parted for him the way crowds always did, instinctively, the way river water parts around a stone too large to move. He had walked toward her with the gun still warm in his holster, and the blood of a stranger still dotting the leather of his vest, and he had stopped 4 feet from her and looked down at her upturned face, and he had said the words that would change everything, the words that the people of Harlan's Crossing would repeat to one another for years afterward, the words that would become the first sentence of a story much longer and more complicated and more beautiful than any of them could have anticipated. He said, "What is your name?" Not "Who are you?" Not "Are you all right?" Not the usual performative concern of a man trying to impress a woman he had just made helpless with spectacle. Just the simplest possible question, asked in a voice that was quiet enough that she had to lean slightly forward to hear it, and that very quietness was a kind of intimacy that the whole street witnessed without understanding. Augusta Dugan looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way a woman looks at something she is deciding whether to trust, weighing it against a history of trusting wrong, measuring it against a calculation she had been running continuously since she stepped off the eastbound stage 4 days ago, with a secret so dangerous it had given her gray hairs at 26. She looked at him and pressed her lips together and said, "I'll tell you when you've earned it." Then she picked up her carpetbag and walked away. Now go back. Go back to how they got there, because the moment on the street was the culmination of something, and the something was a story that deserved to be told properly, from the beginning, which was 6 weeks earlier and 400 miles to the east, in a town called Red Rock, where Augusta Dugan was not yet Augusta Dugan, but was still Augusta Fielding, and where the name she had been born with was about to become a liability so severe it would force her to trade it for a dead woman's identity and run west with nothing but a carpetbag and a piece of paper she had stolen from a powerful man's desk. The man's name was Harlan Voss. He was not the kind of man whose name you said aloud unless you were certain no one was listening. He was 44 years old and owned 40,000 acres of eastern New Mexico territory, plus the assay office in Red Rock, plus 3 judges, plus the territorial marshal who was supposed to be investigating him. He had made his fortune in cattle and consolidated it in land and laundered the darkest parts of it through the bank he also happened to own, and he had done all of this with such methodical patience that the few people who understood what he was doing were also the few people who were too afraid to say so. Augusta had understood it. She had come to Red Rock as a schoolteacher, which was the most invisible thing a single woman could be in a cattle town in 1883. She had a certificate from the normal school in Cincinnati, and she had genuine intentions, and she had been given a 1-room schoolhouse at the edge of town and a salary of $18 a month, And for the first 3 months, everything had been unremarkable. She taught arithmetic and penmanship and geography to 23 children between the ages of 6 and 14, and she attended Sunday services, and she bought her modest weekly groceries at the general store, and she attracted no particular attention. But she was also her father's daughter. Her father, Edward Fielding, had been a land surveyor. A federal land surveyor specifically, which meant that he worked for the General Land Office and carried documents that described, with the legal precision of metes and bounds and meridian lines, who owned what and by what authority. He had been sent to eastern New Mexico Territory in 1881 to survey and verify the land grants in the region, and he had discovered something in the course of that work that had gotten him killed in what the territorial marshal had officially classified as a riding accident. Augusta had never believed it was an accident. She had traveled to New Mexico after his death, not openly as his daughter but as a teacher answering a legitimately posted position, because she knew that if Harlan Voss connected her to Edward Fielding, she would be in danger before she could establish anything. She had spent 3 months being invisible and unremarkable and gathering, piece by piece, the evidence that her father had assembled before his death, evidence that he had hidden in 3 different locations across Red Rock because he had been careful and he had known he was being watched. What she found, when she finally had all the pieces, was breathtaking in its scope and its corruption. Harlan Voss had filed fraudulent land claims on approximately 60,000 acres of land to which he had no legitimate title. Some of that land belonged, by treaty, to Apache communities. Some of it belonged to small ranchers who had been quietly driven off, and whose original claim papers had conveniently disappeared from the county records. Some of it was federal land that Voss had essentially stolen from the American public with the complicity of the territorial officials he owned. And the mechanism by which he had done all of this ran through the assay office and the bank, where a series of fabricated surveys and forged documents had created a paper trail that looked, to anyone examining it superficially, like legitimate business. But her father had gone deeper than the surface, and so had she. She had found the original surveys, the real ones, the ones her father had completed before his death, the ones that contradicted every single fraudulent document Voss had filed. They were hidden inside the false bottom of a wooden Bible box in the storage room of the schoolhouse, and when she found them and spread them on the floor of her small rented room and spent 2 days comparing them against the public records she had carefully copied from the county clerk's office, the full picture had assembled itself with terrible clarity. She had also found something else, something she had not expected, and that made the entire situation both more urgent and more dangerous. Among her father's papers was a partial list of names, men in the federal government and the territorial government who had received payments from Voss, men who would be destroyed if the truth came out, and who therefore had strong personal reasons for ensuring it never did. The list was incomplete. Her father had clearly been killed before he could finish it, but it was enough to establish that this was not a simple land fraud case. It was a conspiracy that reached into the federal offices in Santa Fe and possibly beyond. She had needed to get those documents to someone who could not be bought. The problem was finding such a person. She had spent 2 more weeks after finding the documents trying to identify a federal contact who was genuinely outside Voss's reach. And it was during those 2 weeks that she made her critical mistake. She had gone to the assay office on a pretext. She told the clerk she wanted to inquire about a small claim she was considering filing, a complete fiction but a plausible one for a woman with a modest teacher's salary who might be considering a small investment. And while she was in the outer office, she had overheard a conversation she was not supposed to hear. Voss himself was in the inner office, speaking with a man she did not recognize, and what she heard through the thin plank wall was not the specific content of fraud, but the specific content of murder. There was a rancher named Caleb Torres who had refused to sell, and who had recently hired a lawyer, and Voss was giving instructions about Caleb tours with a calm specificity that turned Augusta's blood cold. She had left the assay office immediately. She had gone back to her room and stood with her back against the door and understood that she was now carrying knowledge that was, in a very literal sense, fatal. Worse, the clerk had seen her leave in a hurry. She had not managed to keep her face neutral when she came out of the office, and 2 hours later, a man she did not know had walked slowly past her window 3 times. She had packed the carpetbag that night. She had taken her father's documents, the fraudulent record she had copied, the payment list, and one other thing, a land deed that she had removed from Voss's private office on a night 3 weeks earlier when she had stayed late in a building adjacent to it, and used the fact that Voss's secretary was also conducting a secret affair with the wife of the local minister to ensure the office was unattended. The deed was the single most direct piece of evidence. It was a document that bore both the fraudulent survey numbers and Voss's own signature, and her father had noted its location in his hidden papers with the annotation that it was the keystone, that without it the rest was suggestive but deniable. She had taken a dead woman's name from a grave in the Raydrock Cemetery, a woman named Augusta Dugan who had died of fever in 1879 at the age of 24. 2 years before Augusta Fielding arrived in New Mexico territory, and therefore someone no one currently in town would strongly remember. She had written herself a letter of reference as Augusta Dugan, and had answered an advertisement for a laundress position in Harlan's Crossing, a town 90 miles west, which was the furthest she could get with the money she had, and which was also, according to her careful map reading, the nearest town to the Federal Land Office substation in Silver Wells, where a man named Deputy Commissioner Garrett Reed operated and who had, according to her research, never appeared on any of Voss's payments, and who had a reputation for incorruptible stubbornness that had made him several enemies in the territorial administration. She had left Raydrock on a stage heading north, then transferred twice, then caught the westbound stage to Harlan's Crossing, and she had made herself small and unremarkable for 4 days of travel, and had arrived in Harlan's Crossing with the documents tucked into the lining of her carpetbag, and a name that was not hers and a secret that felt, by that point, like a stone she had swallowed. She had been in town for less than 3 hours when Harlan Voss's men found her. She did not know how they had tracked her so quickly. She had been careful. She believed she had been careful. But later, when she had time to think it through, she would realize that Voss's resources were simply larger than she had accounted for, that a man who owned judges and a marshal also had informants at stage stations, and a network of communication that outpaced the speed of a stage coach when motivated by the right kind of danger. He had known she was a threat even before she left. He had simply needed to find out where she had gone. The 4 men on Caldwell Street had not been random troublemakers. They were professionals. They had been waiting for a woman carrying a particular carpetbag, and they had found her outside the general store where she had gone to ask after the laundress position she had applied for, and they had moved to intercept her with the practiced coordination of men who had done this kind of thing before. She had not panicked. This was important, because panic would have made her helpless, and Augusta Fielding, Augusta Dugan now, she reminded herself with the discipline of survival, had never been good at helplessness. She had turned to face them with her chin up and her grip firm on the carpetbag, and she had calculated, in the approximately 4 seconds she had before they reached her, whether she had any viable options. She had concluded she did not. And then Isaiah Crawford had stepped out of the barber shop. He had clearly just been in the middle of a haircut, because one side of his dark hair was freshly trimmed and the barber's cloth was still tucked into his collar, and he had paused on the boardwalk and taken in the situation with a single sweep of those dark eyes, and he had done something that would take Augusta a long time to fully understand. He had not needed to ask any questions. He had not needed to establish context or determine merit or confirm that she was actually in danger. He had simply looked at the four men and looked at her and stepped off the boardwalk into the street and said, in that quiet voice that carried without effort, "I think that's far enough." What happened next was quick and terrible, and in the way of such things, somehow almost elegant. The four men were competent. Isaiah Crawford was something more than competent. He was the specific kind of dangerous that comes not from aggression, but from precision, from the absolute stillness that precedes violent motion, from a speed of hand and clarity of judgment that the four men had clearly encountered before, because two of them hesitated in a way that cost them exactly the advantage that hesitation costs a man in a fast-draw confrontation. The fight lasted approximately 45 seconds and left all four men unable to continue, though none of them was fatally shot. A fact that Augusta would later understand was deliberate, not accidental, because Isaiah Crawford was also the specific kind of dangerous that knew exactly how to stop a threat without creating a corpse, and he had reasons for preferring it that way. Then he had turned, and he had walked toward her through the settling dust, and he had asked her name. And she had not given it. She had not given it because she was carrying someone else's name and could not afford the confusion, and because she was carrying secrets that could get her killed and had not yet decided whether this man was safe, and because she was, at the bottom of everything, a woman who had been operating alone for long enough that trust had become a luxury she could no longer casually afford. But she had walked away thinking about him. She had walked away thinking about the barber's cloth still tucked into his collar, and the quietness of his voice, and the fact that he had stepped into the street without any information except the evidence of his own eyes, which she found, in the privacy of her own thoughts, extraordinarily affecting. She did not see him again for 4 days. In those 4 days, Augusta established herself in Harlan's Crossing with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had been reinventing herself under pressure. She took the laundress position, which was held by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, who ran a commercial washing operation out of the back of her house, and who was glad enough for the help that she did not ask very many questions. She rented a small room at the boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Prattley, who was sharp-eyed and motherly in equal measure, and who, Augusta suspected, knew considerably more about the residents of Harlan's Crossing than most people would guess. She sent a carefully worded letter to Deputy Commissioner Garrett Reed in Silver Wells, identifying herself only as a concerned party in possession of material evidence regarding federal land fraud in Harlan County, and requesting a private meeting at his earliest convenience. She also gathered what intelligence she could about Isaiah Crawford. This was not purely personal interest, she told herself. She needed to understand the landscape of this town, and a man who had just disabled 4 armed strangers in the middle of its main street was definitively part of that landscape. She asked questions carefully, indirectly, the way she had learned to ask questions during her 3 months in Reed Rock, working them into conversations about unrelated subjects, listening to what was said around the edges of direct answers, building a picture from fragments. What she assembled was this. Isaiah Crawford was 30 years old, which she had not expected from the self-possession he projected. He had been born in Tennessee, the son of a freedman blacksmith and a Cherokee woman, which meant he carried himself in a world that had never been designed to accommodate him, and had constructed his own terms of engagement with it through a combination of skill and the particular kind of quiet authority that cannot be argued with. He had served 2 years as a deputy marshal in the Arizona Territory before something had happened, the details of what were unclear, and people were oddly reluctant to specify, that had caused him to resign. He had been in Harlan's Crossing for approximately 8 months, working as a range rider for a small ranching operation owned by a man named Tom Aldridge, who was apparently one of the ranchers who had somehow managed to hold his land against the pressure of Harlan Voss's expansion. That last detail was like a match struck in a dark room. Tom Aldridge's land was on the eastern edge of Harlan County, and Augusta knew from her research that it was land Voss wanted badly, land that sat between his existing holdings in a way that would significantly consolidate his range. And if Aldridge had managed to resist Voss's usual methods of acquisition, which included both legal pressure and the kind of unofficial intimidation that those four men on Caldwell Street represented, then Isaiah Crawford was perhaps the reason why, which meant that Isaiah Crawford and Augusta Dugan were, without knowing it, already in the same fight. She was turning this over in her mind on the fourth day, a Tuesday, sitting in the small yard behind Mrs. Calloway's house and working through a load of cotton shirts over the washboard, when she heard the gate creak and looked up and found him standing there. He was not wearing the barber's cloth anymore. He was dressed in a clean shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and dark trousers and his gun belt, and his hat was in his hand rather than on his head, which she understood immediately as a deliberate signal of something, not submission, exactly, but the intentional vulnerability of a man who knew the value of such signals and chose them carefully. He said, "Mrs. Calloway said you were here." Augusta put down the shirt she was washing and straightened up. She was aware that she was wearing her working dress, the plain dark one with the rolled sleeves, and that her hair was coming down from its pins in the heat, and that her hands were wet and reddened from the washboard. She was aware that she looked nothing like a woman trying to make an impression, and she found to her surprise that this awareness was not embarrassing. It was almost a relief. She said, "She should not have done that," he said. "She seemed to think it was all right. Mrs. Calloway's judgment about what is all right is not the same as mine." He looked at her steadily. His eyes in daylight were a deep brown that picked up the warmth of the afternoon sun, and there was something in them that was not aggression and was not the usual performative interest of a man approaching a woman he found attractive. It was something more like concern. She had been studied enough in her life to know the difference between being looked at and being seen, and this felt uncomfortably like the second thing. He said, "Those men who came after you in the street, they came after you for a reason." She kept her expression neutral. "Most violence has a reason. Do they know you're here in town? You're asking whether the danger followed me." "Yes." She considered him. She considered, specifically, the intelligence she had gathered about his connection to Tom Aldridge, and the connection between Tom Aldridge and Harlan Voss, and the fact that if Isaiah Crawford was already in opposition to Voss, then she and he were not enemies and might, under different circumstances, be something else. But she had learned enough caution to know that the logic of shared enemies did not automatically produce shared trust. She said, "Why are you interested?" He said without any particular self-consciousness, "Because I intervened in a fight that wasn't mine 4 days ago, and I've been thinking about why ever since, and the honest answer is that it was partly because you didn't run." Augusta looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I don't run." "I know," he said. "That's what I've been thinking about." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable in the way silences usually are, not the silence of two people waiting for one of them to say something suitable, but a different kind of silence, the kind that happens when two people are separately acknowledging something they are not yet ready to say aloud. Augusta picked up the shirt again. "I'm working. I can see that. If you want to talk to me, you can come back at a reasonable hour when I'm not occupied." "What's a reasonable hour?" She glanced up at him. 6 o'clock, the dining room at the boarding house." He put his hat back on, which she had come to understand was his version of agreement. 6 o'clock, he said, and turned and left through the gate. She did not watch him go. She went back to the washboard and spent the rest of the afternoon having an entirely internal argument with herself about the wisdom of what she had just done. At 6 o'clock, she was in the dining room of Mrs. Prattley's boarding house, having changed into her better dress and repinned her hair, and she was slightly annoyed with herself for having done either of those things, because the whole point was to have a practical conversation with a man who might be an ally, and not to make it into something it was not. He arrived exactly at 6, which told her something she filed away carefully. They sat across from each other at the long table that Mrs. Prattley set for her boarders each evening, and they ate the mutton stew that was served, and the fresh corn bread that was the best thing Augusta had eaten since arriving in Harlan's Crossing, and they talked carefully around the thing they were both actually thinking about while learning the shape of each other. She learned that he had grown up in Chattanooga, that his father had built a blacksmith business with a patience and skill that had eventually earned him the respect of even those who had initially resisted giving it, that his mother had died of typhoid when he was 12, and that loss lived in him, the way foundational losses do, quietly and structurally. She learned that he read, which surprised her, and then surprised her that she was surprised, and she recognized that surprise as a prejudice she needed to examine. He had a copy of a Frederick Douglass speech in his coat pocket, she noticed, when he reached for something, and she did not comment on it, but it reorganized something in her assessment of him. He learned, she gave him this much, that she was from Cincinnati, that her father had been a surveyor, that she had come west looking for a different kind of life than the one the East had been offering a single woman of 26 with an education she had nowhere appropriate to apply. She did not tell him her real name. She did not tell him about the documents in her carpetbag. She did not tell him about Harlan Voss or the dead rancher Caleb Torres whose murder she might have just prevented, or she might have only delayed, or about the letter she had sent to Garrett Reed in Silver Wells. But when supper was finished and the other boarders had drifted away and they were sitting with the last of their coffee, she said, without quite planning to, "You work for Tom Aldridge." He looked at her with a slight adjustment of attention that told her he understood the significance of the statement. "I do. Aldridge has been resisting pressure to sell." A pause, careful and measuring. "He has. The pressure comes from the east side of the county." He set down his coffee cup. "Miss Dugan," he said, and the false name landed with a small weight that she absorbed without changing her expression. "What is it that you know?" She looked at him across the table. The kerosene lamp between them threw warm light on both their faces, and outside the window the sound of Harlan's Crossing settling into its evening drifted in through the gauze curtain, and Augusta Dugan, who was still at the bottom of herself, Augusta Fielding, her father's daughter, made a decision. She said, "I know a great deal, and I need help getting it to a federal official before the man who wants it destroyed finds out I have it." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. This one had weight and urgency in it. Isaiah said, "Tell me," she told him, "not everything, not all at once." She told him the shape of it first, the land fraud, the forged surveys, the corrupted officials, and watched his face as she spoke and read in it the recognition of someone who had already been looking at the shadows of this picture from another angle. She told him about her father. She watched his face change when she said that, watched the concern in it deepen into something that was partly anger on her behalf and partly, she thought, a kind of grief by proxy, the recognition of loss in a life that had known its own. She did not tell him about the land deed in the carpetbag, because the land deed was her single most important piece of evidence, and she had learned not to reveal her strongest card even to potential allies. Not yet. Not until trust was more established. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "The man sending those men after you, does he know you're in Harlan's Crossing specifically?" "I believe so. The men on the street were waiting for me." "Then we don't have as much time as we'd like." "No," she agreed. He said, "Garrett Reed, in Silver Wells." She nodded. "Reed is legitimate," he said. "I've had dealings with him before. He's difficult and unpleasant, and he follows the law with more rigidity than most people find comfortable, but he can't be bought, and he has enough authority to move this up the chain to the Land Commissioner's office in Washington if the evidence warrants it." "I believe it does." He looked at her steadily. "If you're right about the scale of this, it won't just be 4 men they send. I know that, and you came here alone." "I am always alone," she said, and there was nothing self-pitying in it, just the factual statement of a woman who had been operating in the world on her own terms since her father died and had stopped thinking of it as unusual. Something moved through his expression that was not pity. She would have closed down immediately at pity, but was something adjacent to it, and yet different. Something that looked like recognition, and also like the very early stirrings of something she was not ready to name. He said, "You're not alone now." Augusta looked at him carefully, wanting to determine if that was a promise or just a sentence, and found in his face that it was the former, and felt something shift in her chest that she had not expected and did not entirely welcome, because she was already carrying a great deal, and this particular feeling was going to require attention she could not currently spare. She said, "You don't know me." "I know what I've seen," he said. "I know you didn't run. I know your father died for this. I know you came 400 miles by yourself with a false name and a bag full of evidence, and you've been sitting on it for 4 days without breaking." He paused. "I know enough." She pressed her lips together and looked at the table and then looked back up at him. "There's more I haven't told you. I expect there is. When the time is right, I will." He nodded. "All right. I need to know," she said carefully, "what your actual interest in this is. Not the moral interest, I assume that. I mean the practical, personal interest. What does Harlan Voss's exposure do for you specifically?" He considered the question, the way he seemed to consider most things, with a deliberateness that she found increasingly reassuring in its honesty. He said, "2 years ago, when I was working as a deputy marshal in Arizona, I was investigating a land fraud case smaller scale than this, but the same basic structure. The man I was investigating had connections that reached into the marshal's service. I was told to close the investigation. I refused. I was given a choice between resigning and being brought up on manufactured charges of evidence tampering." She went still. "They forced you out. They gave me a very small amount of time to choose. And you chose to resign. I chose to walk away from a fight I couldn't win at that point, with evidence I wasn't prepared to move properly, against opponents I hadn't fully mapped." He paused. "It was the right tactical decision, and I have spent 2 years disagreeing with myself about whether it was the right human one." Augusta understood this in a way that was almost physical, because she had spent the past year and a half making similar calculations and carrying similar doubt. She said, quietly, "Sometimes the right tactical decision is the only thing that keeps you alive long enough to make a better one later." He looked at her with something in his eyes that was, she thought, the closest thing to relief she had yet seen him express. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." They sat for a moment in the specific warmth of two people who have recognized something in each other. She said, "So you want this for the record, for the principle?" "I want this because if I don't help you and you don't make it to read, then the bad decision I made 2 years ago is a permanent one. I want this because Tom Aldridge has been living under this threat for 3 years and he's a good man and he doesn't deserve it. I want this because your father deserves it." He met her eyes. "And I want this because the men who came after you today are going to come again. And I don't want to be in a position where I stop them once and then let them finish the work." Augusta looked at him across the lamplight table in the boarding house in Harlan's Crossing and felt, with the specific quality of certainty that comes when something has been quietly building for longer than you realized, that she was going to trust Isaiah Crawford. Not yet completely, but the beginning of it, the commitment to its direction. She said, "There's a land deed in the lining of my carpetbag. It's the single most critical document. If Voss's men take me and take the bag, the deed cannot fall into their hands." Isaiah said, "Can you copy it?" "I have. I made 2 additional copies before I left Redrock." He nodded slowly. "Where are they?" "One is in a letter I mailed to my father's former colleague at the General Land Office in Cincinnati. The other is inside the lining of my second petticoat, which is in the trunk in my room." He looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time, almost amusement. "You planned for multiple points of failure." "I planned for the possibility that I would not survive," she said plainly. The copies are useless without me to testify to their origin and the manner of their acquisition. But they are better than nothing. The amusement faded into something more serious. You're not going to die, he said. You can't promise that. No, he said. But I can promise to make it significantly harder for anyone to arrange it. That night, lying in her narrow bed in Mrs. Pratley's boarding house with the carpetbag under the mattress, Augusta stared at the ceiling and thought about Isaiah Crawford with the honest appraisal of a woman who had stopped deceiving herself about the nature of her own emotional responses. He was, she admitted in the quiet of her own mind, the most compelling person she had encountered in a very long time. Not because of the fight in the street, though the competence and the choice of that had impressed her. Because of the reading material in his pocket and the way he listened, and the specific texture of his honesty, which was not the blunt self-congratulating honesty of a man who mistakes frankness for virtue, but the more careful honesty of a man who has thought about what he owes the people he speaks to and has arrived at genuine candor as the answer. She thought about his history, the resignation, the manufactured charges, the choice that still clearly cost him something when he spoke of it. She thought about his father, the blacksmith, and his mother who had died too young, and she thought about what it meant to move through the world as he moved through it, with the specific compounded weight of a society that had decided, on the basis of his parentage and his appearance, that he was not entitled to the things he had clearly earned 3 times over. She thought about what he had said. You're not alone now. She pressed her fingers against the place in her sternum where those words had landed, and she thought about how long she had been alone, how the loneliness had settled into the structure of her days so completely that she had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a weight you've been carrying long enough, and she thought about what it might mean to put it down. Then she told herself firmly to go to sleep because sentimentality was a luxury for after the crisis was resolved, and she had work to do tomorrow. The reply from Garrett Reed arrived in 3 days. It was terse and practical, which was consistent with his reputation. He said he would meet her in Harlan's Crossing on the 15th, which was 11 days away, at the address she had specified, the boarding house, and that she should have her documentation organized and ready for review, and that she should tell no one else of his coming. She showed the letter to Isaiah that evening, at what had by then become their established meeting time and place, the dinner table at Mrs. Pratley's, which Mrs. Pratley herself clearly interpreted with some knowing satisfaction. Isaiah read the letter carefully and looked up. 11 days, yes, that might be enough time, he said, and it might not be. They know you're here, they're going to move again. I know. He folded the letter and returned it to her. I'm going to stay closer, he said. I've already spoken to Tom Aldridge about it. He understands the situation. You told Aldridge. Enough of it. He deserves to know what we're dealing with and why. He paused. He's been living under this shadow for 3 years. He's been waiting for someone to give him a reason to fight back with something other than a gun. He looked at her. You've given him that. Augusta absorbed this. The idea that her information was providing something useful beyond its direct purpose, that it was functioning as a kind of hope for people like Tom Aldridge who had been enduring without the tools to fight, that was something she had not fully accounted for in her calculation of its value, and it moved her more than she expected. She said, I want to meet him. Isaiah looked mildly surprised, then thoughtful. That could be arranged. I want to know who I'm fighting for, she said. Not just the principle. The specific people. Something in his face did a quiet, private thing that she was beginning to learn to read. He said, all right. Tom Aldridge turned out to be a weathered man in his late 50s with hands like oak roots, and a way of speaking that was economical and weighted. His wife, Maria, was a stout, warm woman of Mexican descent, whose family had been in this part of the territory for 3 generations, and whose own stake in the land was therefore both personal and ancestral, in a way that Harlan Voss's fraudulent documents could not touch but had tried to. They had 2 sons, both working the range, and a daughter who was 16, and doing her schooling from correspondence primers that Augusta, encountering her over the supper table, diagnosed immediately as hopelessly insufficient. Maria Aldridge fed Augusta the best meal she had eaten since leaving Cincinnati, and then sat down across from her at the kitchen table and looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had been sizing up threats and allies for decades and said, "You are the one who has the papers." Augusta said, "I have the papers." Maria looked at Isaiah, who was leaning against the kitchen wall with his arms folded, and then back at Augusta. "And this one will keep you safe long enough to deliver them." It was not a question, but Augusta answered it anyway. "That is the plan." Maria picked up her coffee cup. "Then we will pray that the plan is sufficient and that God has somewhat better organizational skills than the territorial government." Augusta laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in. She tried to calculate it and found she could not a very long time. The sound of it surprised her and seemed to surprise Isaiah too, because she caught him looking at her with an expression that he had not quite managed to put away before she turned toward him, an expression she filed away in the part of her memory reserved for things that required later consideration. The danger escalated on the 8th day. She was returning from Mrs. Calloway's in the late afternoon, on the route she had established as her regular one, because Mrs. Calloway's laundry service was her cover employment, and she needed to maintain the appearance of it, when she noticed the man. He was sitting outside the saloon in a posture of leisure that was slightly too deliberate, slightly too still, the pose of a man who was performing relaxation rather than experiencing it. He had the look of someone who had ridden hard to get here recently, and his boots were dusty in a way that was inconsistent with the amount of time his posture implied he had been sitting. She walked past him without changing her pace and felt his attention track her and did not look back. She found Isaiah at Tom Aldridge's stable where he had been working since the previous day, and she told him about the man with the flat, direct efficiency of someone reporting an operational threat. Isaiah listened. He said, "There's been a rider coming in from the east for the last 2 days. Different man each time. They're building a picture of where you are and what your movements look like." "How many?" "I've identified 3 so far, possibly more." She thought about this. "They won't move until they're sure they can take the documents without leaving a clear trail. Voss can't afford an obvious kidnapping or killing in town, not when he doesn't control this county the way he controls Harlan County. That buys us some time, not much. 3 more days until Reed arrives." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Augusta." It was the first time he had used her name, even the false one, directly, without a title, and the way he said it was different from how it sounded when anyone else said it. She looked at him. He said, "If they make a move in the next 3 days, I need you to do exactly what I tell you in the moment. Not because I know better than you've proven multiple times that you know a great deal, but because in a physical confrontation, communication has to be immediate and complete, and there's no time for negotiation." She understood what he was really asking, which was not for blind obedience but for a specific kind of trust in a specific kind of moment. She said, "Agreed. On the condition that if I assess a situation differently and I have information you don't, I tell you immediately." "That's not a concession, that's a requirement," he said. "I need you to tell me everything always, not just in emergencies." She held his gaze. "All right," she said. He held her gaze back, and again there was that something between them that existed in the silence around the practical words, something that was building with the patient inevitability of a tide, and that both of them were, for different reasons, not yet addressing directly. The attack came on the 10th day, 2 days before Reed was scheduled to arrive. It came at night, which was when she had assessed it would come, because the cover of darkness limited witnesses, and because her room at the boarding house was on the ground floor with a window that faced the alley, a fact she had noted as a vulnerability from the first day. She had taken precautions. She had moved the documents from the carpetbag into the waistband of her sleeping clothes, wrapped in oilskin, which was uncomfortable but practical. She had also, because she was her father's daughter and had learned certain things from him that were not typical schoolteacher accomplishments, kept the small, single-shot Derringer pistol she owned loaded and under her pillow. And she had told Isaiah, who had been sleeping in the stall of the Aldridge stable 6 blocks away, that if she had not sent a message by midnight she was in trouble. She woke at 11:40 to the sound of a window being eased open. She lay still and breathed deliberately and let her eyes adjust to the darkness and counted the sounds. 2 men, she thought, from the weight and positioning of the footsteps, one at the window and one in the alley as a lookout. The one coming through the window was large. She could hear it in the flexion of the floorboard when he hit the ground, the specific creak of weight. He did not light a lamp, which meant he either had a very good mental map of the room from prior surveillance, or was not particularly worried about navigating in the dark. She let him get halfway to the bed before she sat up with the derringer pointed at the center of mass she could barely see and said, in a voice that was quieter and steadier than she had expected of herself, "Stop exactly where you are." He stopped. She heard his breath, ragged from tension. She said, "I am going to fire if you move and I will not miss." There was a pause. Then he moved anyway, not at her but toward the window, scrambling. And she did not fire because he was retreating, not attacking, and she was not the kind of person who shoots a man in the back who is leaving. But the commotion brought the lookout from the alley into the window frame, and that was when the door of her room came open, and Isaiah was there with his gun already drawn, and the mathematical clarity of the situation resolved itself in approximately 2 seconds. Both men were outside the window and running before Isaiah fully crossed the threshold. He looked at her in the dark room. "Are you hurt?" "No." She lowered the derringer. She noted with some clinical distance that her hand was perfectly steady. "There were 2 of them. I saw them go over the back fence." He moved to the window and looked out and then came back. "They're gone for now. They'll report back." "They didn't get the documents." "Good." He looked at her with the particular quality of attention that people give to people who have just been in danger and are making sure they're all right in a way that the people don't always admit to needing. "Good," he said again. She became aware then that she was sitting on the bed in her sleeping clothes with her hair unbound, and the oilskin packet in her waistband and the derringer in her hand, and that Isaiah Crawford was standing 6 feet away looking at her in the dark, and that this was the most physically unguarded she had been in front of another person in a very long time, and she felt it acutely, this specific vulnerability, and found to her complex surprise that it was not unwelcome. She said, "We cannot wait another 2 days. "No," he agreed. "We need to get you to Reed." He said to wait for him here. "Reed is ex-cavalry," Isaiah said. "He'll understand a change of plans when the alternative is losing the evidence." He paused. "I know how to reach him quickly. Tom Aldridge's son can ride to Silver Wells overnight. We can have Reed here by tomorrow evening if we move now." Augusta stood up from the bed. She put the derringer in the pocket of her house coat and touched the oilskin packet through the fabric of her waistband and made the decision in the way that she had learned to make decisions under pressure, quickly, completely, without the luxury of revisiting it afterward. She said, "Send the rider." Aldridge's older son, Daniel, was 18 and had grown up on horseback and covered the 40 miles to Silver Wells in a little under 6 hours, which was impressive enough that even Garrett Reed, who was not easily impressed, noted it when he rode into Harlan's crossing the following afternoon. Reed was a compact, iron-haired man of 51, with the permanently suspicious squint of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people were trying to deceive him. He shook hands with Augusta in the parlor of Mrs. Prattley's boarding house and looked at her with those suspicious eyes for a long moment, and then said, "You're Edward Fielding's daughter." She did not ask how he knew. Said, "Yes. Your father sent me a letter 2 years ago, partial. He died before he could complete it." Something shifted behind the suspicious eyes. "I looked into what I could from his partial information and hit walls everywhere I turned. What do you have?" She set the carpetbag on the parlor table and opened the false bottom and began to arrange the documents. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense, most focused work Augusta had done since assembling the evidence in the first place. Reed went through every document, every survey, every copied record, every page of her father's original findings with a methodical thoroughness that was, she recognized, the thoroughness of a man who understood that every gap could be exploited by a good attorney and needed to be closed before the case went anywhere. Isaiah sat in the corner of the parlor and said very little, but his presence was an anchor, something she found herself orienting toward in the moments when Reed's relentless questioning made the room feel compressed. When Reed picked up the land deed, the keystone, the one with Voss's signature and the fraudulent survey numbers, he held it for a long time and then looked up at Augusta and said, "Where did you get this?" She told him. Everything, including the night she had taken it from Voss's office. Reed was quiet. Then he said, "I need to tell you that the manner in which this was obtained is going to be a problem in a formal proceeding." "I know that," she said. "Which is why I need to establish that it was obtained as part of a private effort to expose a fraud that had also resulted in my father's death, not as a law enforcement action, and why the copies I made from the public records, which are entirely legitimate, are the primary evidentiary weight." Reed looked at her over the document. "You've thought about this legally." "I've thought about this for 18 months, she said. He looked at Isaiah. Isaiah said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile. Reed said, "All right, I'm going to take these with me to Santa Fe tonight. I have a contact in the federal district court there, a judge who cannot be bought and who is going to have a very interesting 2 weeks. He began to gather the documents carefully. "You should know that once I move on this, it will be known that you brought it forward. Voss will know. I know that too. You'll need to give a statement, probably more than once. You'll need to be prepared to testify." "I'll testify." Reed paused and looked at her with something that was, underneath the suspicious professional exterior, a kind of respect. He said, "Your father would be proud of you." Augusta pressed her lips together against the sudden and unexpected force of her reaction to that. She nodded once and said, "Please take care of the deed." Reed left before sundown. The paralysis that had been holding Augusta's emotions in careful containment for the duration of the crisis. Since Ray Drock, really, since the night she had packed the carpetbag and chosen the name from the cemetery and stopped being the person she had been, and started being the person, the situation required that paralysis began, slowly and imperfectly, to dissolve. She sat in the boarding house parlor after Reed left and felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been running on urgency and cannot immediately convert to stillness. And Isaiah sat across from her and let her be quiet for a while, which was the right thing to do, and she was aware of it. She said eventually, "I need to tell you my name." He looked at her. She said, "My real name. I've been using Augusta Dugan since I left Reed Rock. It belonged to a woman who died in 1879. I was born Augusta Fielding, and Edward Fielding was my father, and I have been carrying his work for the past 18 months, and I would like someone to know who actually did it." The quietness of his response, the long moment before he spoke, told her that this was not a small thing to him. He said, "Augusta Fielding." "Yes," he said, "it suits you better, I think, though you've made the other one your own." She looked at him steadily. "You knew it wasn't my real name." "I suspected," he said, "the way you never used it naturally, the slight hesitation before you answered to it. You didn't ask. I was waiting for you to tell me when you were ready." She felt that land with the full weight it carried. She said quietly, "That was the right choice." He said with the simple directness that was the quality she most consistently found extraordinary in him, "You can trust me, Augusta." She said, "I know." And she did know with the completeness of something that had been quietly arriving for the past 10 days and had now fully arrived, not as a burst of feeling but as a settled, foundational knowledge. She trusted Isaiah Crawford, and the trust had dimensions that were not purely practical. She said, "In Cincinnati, I had a position at a school. I had a life that was respectable and small and completely insufficient. I left it for my father initially. But I stayed in the West in this because I found that I could not go back to something that small, not after this, not after understanding what the stakes of things actually are when you let yourself care about them properly." He listened with his full attention, the way he always listened. She said, "I don't know what comes after Reed files the case. I don't know what my name will mean when this becomes public. Augusta Fielding will be connected to a fraud prosecution against one of the most powerful men in the territory. That has consequences," he said. "It also has a record. Your father's work will have been completed. His name will be attached to the truth." She nodded. She looked at the table for a moment and then looked back up at him. "I don't know what I'm going to do next," he said. "Stay." And then, carefully, with the specific precision of a man who means to be heard correctly and therefore chooses his words exactly, "Stay in Harlan's Crossing. Not because you're in danger, though that argument still applies for a time. Stay because there are 23 children in the schoolhouse here who don't have a teacher, and because Tom Aldridge's daughter is doing correspondence primers that are 3 years behind where she ought to be, and because this is a place that deserves someone who sees things the way you see them." He paused. "Stay because I would like the opportunity to know you when you are not in the middle of a crisis," he said. "Because what I have seen of you in the middle of one suggests that you are extraordinary, and I would like to know what extraordinary looks like in ordinary life." Augusta looked at him for a long moment. She felt the warmth of it, the uncomplicated directness of it, the way he had said it not as a performance, not as charm, but as the straightforward expression of something true. She said, "I am significantly less impressive in ordinary life." He said, "I doubt that," she said. "You would be taking my word for it." He said, "I've been taking your word for things for 10 days. I haven't found reason to stop." She smiled. It was slow and real and slightly unguarded, and he watched it happen with an expression that was warm and attentive and not at all disguised. She said, "Ask me again in 2 weeks when the crisis has had time to settle." "I'll ask you every day until you give me a definitive answer," he said. She found that she did not object to that. In the weeks that followed, Garrett Reed proved to be exactly as competent and relentless as his reputation suggested. The case he built from Augusta's documents moved through the federal district court in Santa Fe with a speed that surprised everyone, except the people who understood how long the land fraud had been building and how completely bulletproof the evidence was. The fraudulent surveys were voided. The forged documents were formally identified as forgeries. 3 of the territorial officials named on her father's payment list were suspended pending investigation. The territorial marshal was removed from his position and replaced by a federal appointment. Harlan Voss himself was arrested on a Tuesday in November, brought in by federal deputies from Santa Fe, and the arrest was reported in every newspaper in the territory and several outside it. Augusta read the article in the Harlan's Crossing Gazette sitting at the kitchen table of the boarding house, and she felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but was some combination of both, the specific feeling of something completed that had cost more than completion should ever cost. She had already told Mrs. Prattley she intended to stay permanently. She had already inquired about the schoolteacher position and had already been offered it, with a salary of $22 a month, which was $4 more than she had made in Reed Rock, and which she took as a small, satisfying cosmic correction. She had also begun learning the rhythms of Harlan's Crossing and the way you learn the rhythms of a place you intend to belong to, the schedule of the stage, the days when the supply wagons came through, the pattern of the seasons in the high desert, the particular quality of the winter light that came in low and golden through the schoolhouse windows. Isaiah came to dinner every evening. This had become, sometime in the 3rd week after Reed's visit, simply a fact about the world, as natural and unremarkable as the evening star, and the other boarders treated it with the comfortable acceptance of people who had concluded the obvious before the principals had gotten around to stating it. They talked every evening for hours. They talked about his family history and hers, about the history of the territory and the injustices woven through it, the land taken from the Apache communities, which the fraud prosecution had brought some partial redress for, with 3 treaty-protected parcels being restored through the federal process, though both of them understood that partial redress was not justice, was not even close to justice, was the minimum the law would do, and far less than the situation morally required. They talked about this with the honest acknowledgement of people who were not going to pretend that the story was tidier than it was. They talked about his years in Arizona, the investigation that had been shut down, the things he had wanted to do differently in retrospect. They talked about what it had been like to grow up in Chattanooga after the war, the specific complexity of that, the way the war had changed things and hadn't changed them, the way his father had built something from the ground up with a patience and dignity that Isaiah described with a quiet reverence that she found deeply affecting. She told him everything she had not told him during the crisis. She told him about Cincinnati, about the life she had found insufficient, about the way her father's letters from New Mexico had read like dispatches from another, larger world. She told him about the grave in Raydrock where she had found the name Augusta Dugan, the slight guilt she had carried about borrowing it from a stranger's death, the way she had come to feel, over the weeks, that she had honored it more than exploited it. She told him about the loneliness, which was the most private thing, the thing she had not admitted even to herself clearly. She told him how it had accumulated quietly over years, starting when her mother died when Augusta was 17, and intensifying after her father went west and deepened after his death, until it had become the background texture of her existence. She told him this late on a December evening by the fire in the boarding house parlor, and he listened with complete attention, and when she finished, he reached across the arm of his chair and took her hand with a simplicity and certainty that made the loneliness, in that moment, feel not like something she had survived but like something that was over. She looked at their joined hands. She said, "You are going to ask me again." "Yes," he said. "Stay, be here. With me. Let this be what we make." She looked at him in the firelight, this man who had stepped off a boardwalk with a barber's cloth in his collar and changed everything, this man who read Douglas and listened completely and told the truth, and had spent 2 years disagreeing with himself about a decision he had not yet been able to correct until a woman came to town with a carpetbag full of someone else's name and another man's unfinished justice. She looked at him and let herself feel the whole of it without any of the careful management she had been applying to her own feelings since the beginning. She said, "Yes." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a tenderness that was so quiet and so genuine that it bypassed every defense she had spent years constructing, and she let it. The courtship, once begun in earnest, had the quality of two people who have already done the hard work of knowing each other, and are now simply engaged in the pleasure of confirming what they already know. He brought her books. She brought him observations about the territory and its history that he had not encountered from the angle she brought them. They rode out together on Sunday afternoons, renting horses from the livery, and covered the high desert in the long light of the winter that gave way slowly and magnificently to a New Mexico spring that Augusta found so beautiful it sometimes stopped her breathing mid-sentence. He proposed to her on a Saturday in March. They were on the ridge above town, the one with the long view east, sitting on their horses with the late afternoon light turning the land every shade of copper and rose, and he said it without preamble or performance, in the same quiet direct voice he used for everything, because he was not a man who had different voices for different occasions. He said, "I want to marry you, Augusta. Not Augusta Dugan, Augusta Fielding, the woman who came west with her father's work and finished it and sat in a boarding house parlor and told the truth to a stranger, and who I have been thinking about every day since a Tuesday in September when she didn't run." She looked at the eastern horizon, at the land that stretched away toward Raydrock and beyond it toward Harlan County, where Harlan Voss was sitting in a territorial jail awaiting trial. She looked at the land and thought about her father, who had ridden out into this landscape with his instruments and his integrity and had found something worth dying for, and she thought about how the places we love are made not just of the geography but of the people we stand in them with. She said, "Yes." She turned to look at him, and she said it again because it was a word she found she had no objection to repeating. "Yes, Isaiah, I will." He looked at her with an expression that was joy, clean and unguarded, and she thought, "There it is. There is what I have been looking for without knowing it was what I was looking for." They were married in May at the small Methodist church in Harlan's Crossing, and the wedding was attended by Mrs. Prattley and Mrs. Calloway and Tom and Maria Aldridge, and both the Aldridge sons and their daughter Clara, who was now attending Augusta's school and demonstrating a facility with mathematics that made Augusta's teachers' hearts sing with satisfaction. Garrett Reed sent a letter of congratulations from Santa Fe with a postscript that was the closest thing to warmth she had ever seen from him, and she kept it. They moved into a house on the western edge of town that Isaiah had been quietly building with his own hands in the evenings for the past 2 months, a solid, well-made house of adobe and timber with a kitchen that faced east for the morning light and a covered porch that faced south for the long summer evenings. It was not a large house, but it was built with the specific care of a man who understood what he was building it for, and every choice in its construction reflected that understanding. Augusta stood in the kitchen on the evening of their first night in it and ran her hand along the smooth adobe wall and felt the full weight of where she had arrived from where she had been. The distance between the packed carpetbag in Reed Rock and this kitchen in the house her husband had built. And the weight of it was not grief and not triumph, but something that contained both and transcended both, the feeling of a life that has been earned. Isaiah came through the door with the last of the boxes from the wagon and set it down and looked at her looking at the wall and said, "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking that I was right about staying." He crossed the kitchen and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him with the ease of a woman who has decided once and completely, and they stood together in the kitchen that faced east and looked at the walls of the home they had made. Life in Harlan's Crossing settled into a richness that Augusta found daily, specifically extraordinary. She taught school 31 students now, because word had spread that the schoolteacher on the western edge of town was worth taking seriously, and she found in teaching the same satisfaction she had always found in it, the satisfaction of watching understanding occur in a child's face, the particular pleasure of the day when a student grasps something that has been slipping from their reach. She was especially careful with the children who came from the Apache families, who had recently had land restored to them through the fraud prosecution, children who carried a complicated history in the territory, and who deserved an education delivered with the full acknowledgement of their intelligence and their heritage, and their right to be exactly where they were. Isaiah continued to work for Tom Aldridge through that first year, and in the second year, with some of the wages he had saved, and a small parcel of land that Aldridge offered him at a fair price in recognition of 2 years of loyalty and the specific value of what Isaiah had helped bring about, he began to establish a small operation of his own. He was not primarily a cattleman by temperament, but he was organized and capable, and he had a natural authority with animals that came from the same stillness that characterized everything else about him. Harlan Voss was convicted in October of that year on 14 counts of land fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud, and received a 12-year sentence, and the land he had fraudulently acquired was the subject of a continuing federal review that would take several more years to fully resolve, but that resulted, in time, in the return of contested land to a significant number of its rightful owners. Augusta testified twice in the proceedings, and both times she gave her testimony as Augusta Fielding Crawford, her full legal name, her father's name attached to the record that bore his work, and she felt both times the solid specific satisfaction of a debt paid. In their second winter together, Augusta became pregnant with their first child. She told Isaiah on a January evening, by the fire, with the winter wind doing its serious work outside and the adobe walls of their house holding the warmth with the dependable solidity he had built into them. She had known for 2 weeks and had been deciding how to say it, which was perhaps unnecessary, because when she said, "Isaiah, I'm going to have a child," the expression on his face rendered the manner of saying it entirely irrelevant. It was the same clean, unguarded joy she had seen when he proposed, and she thought, that is the face of someone who is happy in the fundamental way, the way that doesn't need anything added to it. He came to her and held her face in his hands with a gentleness that was, at this point, familiar but had not become less affecting, and he said, "When?" "July," she said. He said, "Then we have time to add to the house." She laughed and he laughed with her, and outside the wind did its work, and inside the fire did its work, and the house held. Their son was born in August of 1886, 3 weeks past Augusta's calculation, which the midwife misses. Torres, widow of the rancher Caleb Torres, who had indeed been murdered on Voss's order, and whose death had been one of the counts in the fraud case, assured them was entirely unremarkable, and no cause for the concern that Isaiah was visibly and endearingly unable to fully conceal. They named him Edward for her father. Edward Isaiah Crawford, who came into the world with a voice that, Mrs. Torres noted approvingly, demonstrated excellent frontier prospects. Augusta held her son in the eastern-facing kitchen in the first morning light, and felt the specific quality of a joy that does not require examination or defense, the simplest and most complete thing. She looked at his face, which already had something of Isaiah in its bone structure and something of her father in its brow, and she thought about all the choices that had led to this particular morning, the carpetbag and the false name and the street in Harlan's crossing and the man who had turned and asked her name. She thought, I gave him the wrong answer then, but I have been giving him the right one ever since. Isaiah came in from the morning's early chores and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at her with the child and stood there for a long moment, long enough that she looked up at him. He had a quality in moments of feeling of going very still, the same stillness that characterized him in all the other moments, but with a different quality to it, a fullness rather than a preparation, and she had learned to read it precisely. She said, "Come here." He crossed the kitchen and sat beside her and looked at his son, and she watched him look, and she thought, there are things that cannot be won or earned or argued for. There are things you receive, in the fullness of time and the specific company of the right person, as pure gift. She had spent enough of her life with her fists closed around things. She was fighting for the openness of it. The receiving felt revolutionary. Edward Crawford grew into a child of enormous energy and curiosity, which his mother found wholly satisfying and his father found wholly unsurprising. He walked at 10 months and talked at 14 months, and asked questions from roughly that point forward at a rate that Augusta privately tracked with something between delight and exhaustion. He was at school before he was formally eligible for it, because it was impossible to keep him out once he understood what it was, and his teacher, who was, conveniently, his mother, did not make any serious effort to keep him out. In 1888, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, at Augusta's quiet suggestion, in honor of the Aldridge girl who had become Augusta's first devoted student, and who was by then 17, and had proven, through a combination of Augusta's correspondence primer reform and her own determination, to be one of the most mathematically gifted young people in the county. Clara Crawford was quieter than her brother from the first hour, with her father's particular quality of stillness and her mother's amber eyes, and she regarded the world from her first days with a measuring attention that made both of her parents feel pleasantly observed. The house on the western edge of Harlan's crossing grew, not dramatically, but with the organic addition that a life well lived tends to accumulate. An additional room on the east side for the children. A larger barn that Isaiah built in the summer of 1887 with the help of Daniel Aldridge, who had become a close friend, and Tom Aldridge himself, who was slower now but no less strong-handed. A garden that Augusta planted with a precision that would have been unsurprising to anyone who knew her, organized by growing season and soil type, and the specific practical question of what the family needed, with a deliberate corner of it given over to the purely beautiful flowers that served no function except to be flowers, which she had decided was function enough. The Apache families whose land had been restored were neighbors in a literal and meaningful sense, and Augusta taught several of their children and made it a practice of her school that their history, their knowledge of the land and its uses, their languages as far as she was able to learn them, were part of what was taught rather than erased. This was not without resistance. There were people in Harlan's Crossing who had opinions about the proper content of education, but Augusta had found, over the years, that her opinions on the subject were substantially more immovable than theirs, and she held them with the same quiet tenacity with which she had once held a carpetbag full of her father's unfinished work. Isaiah, in the 5th year of their marriage, was offered the position of deputy marshal for Harlan's Crossing, a position created in the reorganization of the territorial marshal's office following the Voss prosecution and subsequent reforms. He discussed it with Augusta over 3 evenings, which was the amount of time required, she had learned, for him to talk through any significant decision properly, not because he was indecisive but because he was thorough and he valued her perspective not as a courtesy but as a genuine component of his thinking. She said on the 3rd evening, "You want this." He said, "I want to do this correctly this time." She understood the second sentence entirely. "Then take it," she said. "You know this territory, you know the people in it, you know what justice looks like from the inside and the outside both. That's not common," he said. "It would change some things about the daily routine." "Our daily routine has survived frontier winter and 2 children and Harlan Voss," she said. "I think it can accommodate a badge." He looked at her with the warm, private expressiveness that he reserved for her and their children, that she had been the recipient of for 5 years and still found every single time precisely affecting. He said, "Have I told you lately that you are extraordinary?" She said, "You tell me regularly, but I find I don't object to the repetition." He took the badge. He wore it with the same quiet authority that characterized everything else he did, and he was, as Augusta had known he would be, genuinely good at it, thorough and fair, and specifically resistant to the kinds of pressure that had deformed his predecessor. He handled the work of a territory in transition, the conflicts between the old ways and the new, the lingering injustices and the new ones that arrived dressed as progress, with a care and a moral seriousness that people noticed, and that began, in time, to establish a reputation that spread beyond Harlan's Crossing. In 1891, Augusta received a letter from the Federal District Court in Santa Fe informing her that an additional land parcel had been identified as fraudulently claimed under the Voss scheme, and that, as part of the ongoing restitution process, it had been determined that a portion of the proceeds from its recovery were due to the heirs of Edward Fielding, whose survey work had provided the foundational evidence for the entire prosecution. The amount was not enormous, but it was substantial, and more than the money was the official acknowledgement attached to it, the legal document that named Edward Fielding as the originating investigator of the case, and noted that his work had been completed and brought to fruition by his daughter. Augusta sat at the kitchen table with the letter for a long time. Isaiah found her there when he came in from his rounds, and he sat across from her and read the letter when she pushed it toward him, and he read it twice and then looked up at her. She said, "He would have been proud." Isaiah said, "He should have been here to see it." She nodded. The grief of that was real and permanent, and she did not argue with it. But she also said, "I think he is here in whatever way that means anything. He is in the school and the restored land and the record and in Edward and Clara." She paused. "He is in the fact that I stayed." Isaiah reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had taken it in the boarding house parlor years ago by the fire, with the same simplicity and certainty, and she pressed her fingers through his and held on. The years of Harlan's Crossing moved through their seasons with the generosity of a place that has been fought for, and therefore carries the weight of that fighting in every ordinary moment. The schoolhouse expanded twice, once in 1889 and again in 1893, because the population of the town was growing, and the population of children who needed teaching was growing with it. Augusta hired an assistant teacher in 1892, a young woman recently arrived from Missouri named Frances Hall, who was 22 and earnest and intelligent, and reminded Augusta in certain ways of herself at that age, which she found simultaneously endearing and mildly alarming. Edward Crawford at 7 was a child of such relentless intellectual appetite that Augusta had taken to leaving books around the house in the same way other people left food, strategically positioned for him to find and consume at whatever point his current pursuit exhausted itself. He had developed a particular fascination with geology, which was perhaps inevitable given that he lived in a landscape that wore its geological history on the surface, and he collected rock specimens with a systematic thoroughness that Augusta recognized, with a private smile, as inherited. Clara at 4.5 was a person of grave precision and devastating perceptiveness. She had begun to read at 3, which she had done in a way that suggested she had been privately teaching herself for some time before she elected to reveal it, and she delivered her observations about the world in a voice that was quiet enough that people sometimes underestimated how completely she was paying attention, an error they typically did not make more than once. She had her father's eyes now, the deep warm brown, and her mother's way of holding her ground. In the late summer of 1893, a decade after Augusta had arrived in Harlan's Crossing with a borrowed name and a carpetbag full of her father's unfinished justice, she stood on the covered porch of the house Isaiah had built and watched the sun go down over the high desert in that specific New Mexico September light that she had come to love with the whole of herself, the light that turned everything simultaneously golden and shadow-edged, the light that made the land look like something consecrated. Isaiah came out of the house and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee and gave her one, and they stood together in the evening light and did not say anything for a while, which they could do easily now, which was one of the things she had come to treasure about the specific nature of their being together. That silence between them was full rather than empty. She said eventually, "Do you remember what you asked me? That first day in the laundry yard," he said. "I asked if the danger had followed you. You did." She took a sip of her coffee. "Practical as anything," he said. "What I wanted to ask was something else entirely." She looked at him sideways. "What did you want to ask?" He thought about it. He said, "I wanted to ask why you didn't run, not in a critical way. I wanted to understand the kind of person who stands still in that situation. I wanted to know what that came from," she said. "It came from my father, and from the knowledge that running doesn't make things go away, it just puts distance between you and the ability to affect them." He nodded slowly. "I know that now. I didn't know it as completely then," she said. "You knew enough. You stepped off a boardwalk for a stranger," he said. "You were never a stranger." She turned to look at him fully. This man she had been married to for 8 years, who she knew in every dimension, whose silences and expressions and particular way of considering things she could read as fluently as she could read text, who had been, for those 8 years, her home in a more fundamental sense than any house could be. She said, "Isaiah." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you something I have not told you before." He looked at her with full attention. She said, "When you asked my name on that street, when you walked up through the dust with the barber's cloth still in your collar and asked me what my name was, and I said I would tell you when you had earned it, I meant that I would tell you the real one, the name I was actually carrying, not the borrowed one." She paused. "I knew in that moment that you were the kind of person I might eventually tell the real one to. I did not know what that meant yet, but I knew it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And after I won." She smiled. "After you won. After the dust settled and the crisis resolved and the documents were delivered and Reed did his work and the world organized itself into something manageable, I gave you my name." "The real one," he said. "Augusta Fielding." "Augusta Fielding Crawford," she said. "The whole of it." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him the way she had learned to lean, completely, without reservation, and they stood on the porch in the September light and looked at the desert that had been, for a remarkable number of people, the site of injustice and resistance and the slow, difficult work of repair, and that was also, simply and entirely, their home. Inside the house, Edward's voice rose in the specific excited cadence of a child who has made a discovery, probably geological, Augusta thought, and Clara's measured voice responded in the tone of a younger sibling who has already concluded that her brother's enthusiasm, while genuine, benefits from editorial context. The sound of it moved through the walls of the house and out onto the porch where they stood, and Isaiah's arm tightened slightly around her shoulders, and Augusta pressed her hand against the place in her chest where the loneliness had once lived and found it full. 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Thursday, Augusta was in the schoolroom correcting arithmetic papers when a boy named Miguel, the son of one of the restored Apache families, raised his hand and asked why fractions were called fractions. She put down her pen and thought about it properly, because Miguel's questions deserved proper answers, and she told him about the Latin word fractus, broken, and from there into the whole history of how humans had thought about parts of things, and the class followed her through it with the engaged attention that was her particular talent to produce. And she thought, sitting in the schoolroom in the light that came in from the eastern windows, that this was also what her father's work had made possible. This ordinary excellent Thursday, these children in these chairs, this moment that did not know it was history and did not need to. In the winter of 1894, Augusta discovered she was pregnant again. She was 37, and the midwife Mrs. Torres said that it was not unusual but that she should take reasonable care, and Augusta said that reasonable care was something she was willing to attempt, and Isaiah said that he intended to ensure it, which led to a discussion about the limits of his jurisdiction that Augusta found amusing and he found less so. Their second son was born in the spring of 1895, healthy and vociferous, and they named him James Thomas James for Isaiah's father, Thomas for Tom Aldridge, who wept when they told him and then spent some time looking out the window pretending he had not, which everyone graciously accommodated. By then the family had grown in its sense of itself from a unit into a kind of small foundation, the house on the western edge of town that people in Harlan's Crossing referenced as a landmark not just spatially but socially, the place you went with a land question or a school question or a dispute that needed a level head, the place where Isaiah Crawford's jurisdiction as deputy marshal extended into the informal authority of a man whose fairness was known and relied upon. The place where Augusta taught the older children who needed extra instruction in the evenings, which was 3 nights a week, and which she did not count as work because it did not feel like work. Tom Aldridge died in 1896, peacefully in his own bed, at the age of 68, with Maria beside him and both his sons in the house. Isaiah and Augusta attended the burial and stood at the grave in the dry September wind, and Isaiah held Augusta's hand and she held it back, and she thought about all the people who had been in this story without knowing they were in a story, who had been simply living their lives and defending what they had built against the casual predations of people with more power, and who had deserved, at minimum, to hold what they had built. Aldridge had held it. In the end, he had held all of it. Daniel Aldridge took over the ranch and ran it with the same steady competence his father had modeled for him, and Isaiah and Augusta remained close to the family in the way that proximity and shared history create closeness that does not require maintenance because it is structural. Clara Aldridge, who had been Augusta's first truly devoted student, had gone to a women's college in the East on a scholarship that Augusta had spent 3 months assembling the paperwork for, and had returned with a degree in mathematics and a position as a teacher in Silver Wells, and wrote to Augusta regularly in a correspondence that was one of the things Augusta valued most in her life, the record of a mind she had helped grow, and that had grown beyond anything she had planned for. In the kitchen one morning in the late spring of 1898, Augusta was making biscuits and Edward, who was 12, was at the table working through a mathematics problem that was several grades ahead of his age, and that his mother had set him because she had run out of grade-appropriate material. Clara, who was 10, was reading in her particular focused way, the way that closed the world out until something in the text called for comment, which might be in 5 minutes or might be in 2 hours, and you never knew which. James, who was 3, was under the kitchen table building something architectural with wooden blocks that he would discuss if you asked him, and would not discuss if you didn't. Isaiah came through the door from the morning with the sun behind him, and the specific quality of a man who has been outside in good weather and carries the evidence of it. And he poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, and watched the kitchen with the expression that Augusta had learned over 15 years, meant that he was experiencing happiness in its complete form. She looked up from the biscuit dough and looked at him looking at the kitchen and said, "What are you thinking?" He said, "I'm thinking about a Tuesday in September in 1883, when a woman walked away from me on a dusty street and told me to earn her name." She felt the warmth of it, the 15-year-old warmth of it still undiminished. She said, "And did you?" He said, "I'm still working on it." She laughed. Edward looked up from his mathematics with the expression of a child who suspects his parents of something and is not entirely wrong. Clara did not look up from her book, but the slight curve at the corner of her mouth indicated full awareness. James, under the table, placed a block and said with satisfaction, "House." Augusta pressed her floury hands together and looked at the kitchen, at the children arranged in it with the natural randomness of children in a safe place, at her husband leaning against the counter with his coffee and his 15 years of knowing her, at the walls that held the morning light, at the eastern window through which the New Mexico spring came in clear and clean, and full of the specific promise that had drawn her west in the first place, the promise of a larger life. The promise of things worth doing and people worth doing them beside. She looked at all of it and thought, here is the answer. Here is what she gave him after he won, not just the name. Augusta Fielding, born in Cincinnati, her father's daughter, who had come west with a borrowed identity and a carpetbag full of justice and had found, in the settling dust of a street fight she had not started and had not run from, the beginning of the truest thing she had ever known. She gave him the name and the story behind it, and the year after that and the year after that. And she gave him Edward in August and Clara in June and James in the spring. And she gave him the evenings on the porch and the mornings over coffee and the arguments about jurisdiction and the dinners with the Aldridges and the schoolroom Thursdays and all the ordinary days that were not ordinary at all, that were built from the specific extraordinary fact of two people who had found each other in the middle of something important and had stayed. She gave him everything she had, and he gave her the same, and in the morning light of the kitchen with the biscuits and the mathematics problem and the architectural blocks and the book and the coffee, with the whole of their made life arranged in its comfortable evidence around them, it was evident that the transaction had been, from every angle, exactly sufficient. She turned back to the biscuit dough and pressed her hands into it and felt the familiar morning satisfaction of it, and she said, without looking up, "Isaiah." He said, "Yes." She said, "I love you." She said it the way she said all the important things, directly, without performance, as the simple statement of a fact she had examined and confirmed and saw no reason to hedge. He put his coffee cup down and crossed the kitchen and pressed a kiss to the back of her hair, warm and unhurried and entirely certain, and he said against her hair, "And I love you." And that, in Harlan's Crossing, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1898, on an ordinary kitchen morning that was not ordinary at all, was the whole and complete answer to the question that had been asked in the dust of Caldwell Street 15 years before. Augusta Dugan, who was Augusta Fielding, who was Augusta Fielding Crawford, who had not run, who had not broken, who had finished her father's work and built her own, looked at the biscuit dough and smiled to herself with the specific private satisfaction of a woman who has arrived, completely, exactly where she was always meant to be, and who knows it. The morning light came through the eastern window. The house held.